Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Andi Meade, and we're going to talk about the life and ministry of a pastor's wife, some of the joys and some of the challenges that go along with that. Andi, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
I'm just so thrilled to be here with you today, Todd.
Let me tell you a little bit about Andi. Andi is part of Graefenburg Baptist Church in Waddy, Kentucky, where her husband Philip serves as pastor. She serves in the Seeds of Grace Women's Ministry at the church. She attended the University of Tennessee, where she completed her Master of Social Work. Andi has experience working as an intake counselor at a psychiatric hospital, as well as doing individual counseling, and we're going to talk more about that. She has 3 children, she and Philip do, Callie Grace, Justice, and Eli, and almost 3 teenagers in the house, which has to provide lots of encouragement, fun, and challenges as well. So Andi, let's jump right into these questions. So we have a lot of folks in, Kentucky Baptist, 2,350 churches. Most of those pastors, pastor and wife together, ministering and serving. And we really want to talk to you about your role and how you and Philip balance out your life and your ministry together. And so being a pastor's wife is a unique calling. And I think many would say it is a calling. So let's just start right there. For you, when you and Philip were dating, were you aware he was going to be a pastor? And was there a sense of calling for you into that role? And if so, tell us about that.
Yeah, when I met Philip, he was a youth pastor already. So I think in some ways, I talked to other pastors' wives whose husband got into the ministry after marriage. And I imagine that would be in many ways trickier.
Yeah.
So it felt right in every way. I'd always felt, I think, a love for ministry and a pull towards ministry of some kind for as long as I can remember. So it felt like a very natural thing to step into for me.
Yeah, it wasn't something that you were awkward about. You could see yourself being in that role. Were there other women who were role models for you as a pastor's wife, women that you've looked to over the years that you think, I want to be, I'm probably more like that, less like that? Was that ever part of your thinking?
Yeah, from my childhood, I had a youth pastor who was my youth pastor all the way through from maybe 6th grade until I graduated, which is a huge deal, so, yeah. And his wife was just delightful, joyful, energetic, easy to talk to. And that has been a really important thing for me, is to provide that, I think, in wherever we've been. I've just been very aware of the need of younger pastors' wives to have a role model, because, Todd, it's such a strange role that there's no textbook, it's not anywhere in the church constitution of this is what we expect from our pastor's wife, so it's just a very fly by the seat of your pants. Yep. And every church has a little bit of a different expectation, and nobody has it written down. And oftentimes nobody will really tell you, you're just trying to feel it out. So I think the need.
Yeah, that can be really difficult, especially when, as in any ministry, if there are unspoken expectations and then you discover that you haven't met those and you're still not sure what they are. So how have you and Philip kind of navigated that in your early days at Graefenburg? You've been there a long, how long have you all been at Graefenburg?
Yeah, so, well, that's an interesting question, Todd, because it's where Philip came to GBC when he was at Southern. This was his church. So that started in 2006. He was the youth pastor. And then we left in 2009 for 2.5 years, and he was a family pastor at First Baptist in Evergreen, Colorado.
Okay.
And then we came back here at the end of 2011, and we've been here ever since.
Okay. So combined 15 years.
Yeah.
Plus.
Yeah.
So early on, how did you all kind of figure out those expectations and manage them together? Was there something that Philip did as pastor to kind of communicate to the church, this is who Andi is and this is who she isn't? Anything about that you could recall?
Yeah, when I was looking over this question and thinking about it, I reflect all the time how really ridiculously blessed I am with my home church. Yeah. GBC is it's not a normal church. Right from the get-go, they're their love and kindness and just adaptability, and they were so welcoming. And I've never felt, not since day one, any kind of pressure to be different than, I was teasing about how like my one talent is talking. Like I'm not, you're not going to find me in the kitchen at GBC. I'll wander in there to have conversations, but that's not my strength at all, and I have never been, I've never felt like I'm less than or like I'm disappointing anybody because I'm not gifted in that area.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well,
Yeah.
good for you and good for them. So, Andy, what would you say are some of the blessings of being a pastor's wife? It's a unique role, and
Yeah.
you're living it out. So, in what ways would you say that God's really blessed your life in that role?
I would say that one of the primary blessings of this role is knowing the sheer volume of people who are praying over me and my family daily by name. I get that comment, and Philip gets that comment from people on a regular basis that they are praying for us by name, and that's overwhelming
Yeah.
and so encouraging. So that the being so loved on, if I were to present that question to my children, they would say the food because yeah, because we just have so many lovely people who bring cookies and cakes and pie. They just will feed us.
Yeah.
So they our church just loves on us so well. So
Yeah.
that was truly an answer when I was asking the kids that question. Just curious what their thoughts were.
That's so good. And your kids are having a great church experience. That
Yeah.
means the world.
Yeah, and it's really their only church experience.
Hmm.
And I've thought about that their whole experience has been shaped at GBC, and what an amazing blessing that is for them.
Andy, I was my daughter's pastor while they were growing up. I left the pastorate to come to work with the convention. They were in their late teen years, my oldest daughter was. And so when our oldest daughter moved here to Louisville and she joined a church in college and then started looking for what she called her adult church. So she started visiting these churches. And she called me one day. She said, I realized that I have PK privilege. And I said, well, what does that mean? She said, well, when I was at where I pastored, she said, I could go into any meeting. I could walk into the deacons' meetings. They were glad to see me. I could show up for the senior adult gathering, so they were glad to see me. And she said, now I'm just a church member. And so
Yeah.
there's a sweet blessing to grow up, for your children to grow up in a home, or in a church rather, where they're loved and cared for. And your children are experiencing that.
Yes, so much, so much, and I think it's such a blessing, and I think I'm going to have to just prepare them when we're launching them. Like this is not what you'll find everywhere.
Yeah.
You know.
Not all churches are the same. So the next question then is, if there are blessings, there are also challenges. I'd be glad to hear your challenges, and even, you're around other minister wives, and you may hear challenges that others reflect back to you as well. So what are some of the challenges you think about being married to a lead pastor, especially in a church?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is wanting to fill in all the needs that there are, wanting to be everywhere all the time, and make sure that there's nothing that's not done that I could do. That's not possible, especially as your church is growing. You just, one person can't, and that's hard to know your own limitations. But Todd, I think one of the hardest for me personally has been, if there is any kind of conflict, if someone has something to say negative about Philip, towards Philip, that is a really difficult place for me to sit back and to not harbor resentment.
Right.
You know what I mean? And then to let that pass, and there's resolution. There's always resolution, and then for me to move on past that.
I think that's uniquely difficult part. A pastor has a leadership role. If there's a challenge that he's having with someone, he can deal with it directly. He can deal with it through lots of different means. But as a spouse, watching that happen and trying not to have hard feelings and not really having an outlet for it. You can't intervene and go fix that for him. You wouldn't want to, but I think that is uniquely probably one of the greatest challenges.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And even like who you can talk to regarding the situation, so it gets really tricky. So I would say that that's a huge, and it goes back to the importance of the relationship between the pastor and the wife too, to be able to have that conversation.
Andy, one of the things that Connie experienced when I was pastoring, that folks would come to her and it almost kind of felt like sometimes they were wanting to say things to me through her, and they'd ask about something or another. She's like, I have no idea what that's about. I don't even know. You'll need to talk to Todd if you want to know about that. And so she quickly just deflected that right where it needed to go, which allowed her to just keep being a church member, and which is what I wanted for her as her pastor.
Yeah, I get that a lot too. Like somebody asked me not that long ago the date of the next mission trip to Alaska, and I was like, oh, it's just really precious that you think I might know the answer to that. It means so much to me, but I do not know.
Oh, that's hilarious. I love that. So, Andy, as you're interacting, Graefenburg is a great church. You've said that, and even the history of the church it's strong. Not every pastor's wife is in that setting. And I know there are other challenges that ministry wives go through. Anything that you are aware of that is kind of unique to the ministry wife role that you've heard others talk about or mention in conferences or gatherings?
I think loneliness. I think that, I think it's a societal epidemic for sure, but there is such a unique role as the pastor's wife, and a burden even, and it's a beautiful burden, but it is a burden to carry. And so I think the loneliness that can come with that, and the isolation, and the feeling of letting people down all the time, going back to like you can't meet every need. I think that's a huge one.
And that goes with ministry, as you said, especially a growing ministry. As the church gets larger, which Graefenburg is a growing church, then it becomes more and more challenging to have as many close relationships and have relationships with new people coming in as well as the ones that are already established. We'll talk a little bit about making friends in the church and how that's can be a little tricky. And folks may not really understand why it's tricky at all. So talk a little bit about maybe why it's a challenge for a pastor's wife. Not hard to make friends. You're friendly. But how is it just a little more, maybe tricky, maybe the
complicated.
Best word. There you go,
complicated. Yeah, I think the word is complicated because, I am married to their pastor, so what we talk about and the nature of our conversations, it directly relates to them, and it's somebody that they're going to see. If I'm talking about my husband, they're going to see him on Sunday morning preaching. So I think there's always that awareness for a pastor's wife that she holds her husband and his reputation in her hands. So I think that can be tricky there. I think what I want to say about friendships and for pastors' wives, I do think being a pastor's wife is a calling. I think, the Lord called Philip to ministry, and he called me to be his wife. So it's definitely a calling, where I think sometimes we misstep or we misunderstand that the calling is there, but the calling doesn't negate that you often have to do some work. As far as if you came from a home that was broken, or there was trauma, or if there was just not good communication, the calling is important and necessary, but generally speaking, it doesn't wipe out all of that, and you still have to do the work of dealing with that. So to come to the ministry as a pastor's wife without doing your own work, you're not going to make good friends. You're not even going to know who a trustworthy person is or what they look like. Does that make sense?
It does. Yep.
So I think that's a big piece for me.
And then I'm sure there's the added complication that your husband preaches on something, and a friend could be like, did you tell the pastor what I was talking to you about? It's like, no, I never said
Yes.
anything about that. It was just providential coincidence or whatever you call it, that
Yeah.
he brought up a subject. And I mean, that can happen too in your role.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, so you and Philip are raising three children together in at Graefenburg Church, and how is that kind of an additional, we could say, joy and challenge in kind of a spotlight? Sometimes the pastor's kids are put on looked at it a different way. I think Graefenburg probably doesn't do that, but it could happen. So
Yeah.
how's that been for you two?
Yeah, I think my kids probably, much like your daughter was saying, like just this lovely experience of really a position of privilege, always being loved on and welcomed. Uh, Philip and I talk a lot about it. It's really a passion of his that we see our children as people and not projects,
Hmm.
and that we allow their personalities to emerge as they come, not what we want them to be, but their interests and hobbies and musical interests, and it's so fun. It's so very fun, especially once you turn loose of that idea of trying to force them into a mold that you want them to be to meet maybe the expectations that you're worried the church will have for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And kids do fun things. Sometimes they do embarrassing things in church. I'm sure that's happened for you and Philip as well.
Yeah, yeah, it has, but I feel like I do more embarrassing things than they do, usually
So
involving my
the
phone.
kids are the ones
So
putting their hand over their head
for
and saying,
sure,
"Mom."
100%. The last time involved my phone going off, and it was right when we were sitting to sing, and I hear an alarm go off, and I'm incensed. I'm like, whose alarm? Who doesn't know to turn their alarm off? And it's the pride goes before a fall, right? Because Eli taps me on the shoulder, and he's like, "Mom, your phone." So, but Eli, my youngest, is that youngest, with the most mischievous. I think
Mhm.
is generally the youngest. So many times, things falling out of his pocket and rolling across the front during the
That's fun.
during the service. So
Well,
yeah.
Andy, let's talk a little bit about your counseling ministry. So you're part of you have a counseling ministry. So tell us, you're involved in biblical counseling. How did you get
Mhm.
into that, and then how has it kind of developed into an actual service or ministry or business?
Yeah. So I have been a counselor since 2001,
Okay.
in the secular setting, and I don't know at this point if there's a population I haven't worked with. I worked with an addiction and in the military and geriatrics and children and family and worked in the early days of our marriage before we had children, and then after we had children worked in intake at the Brook,
Wow.
and as well as I that change without Christ isn't possible. It's just not possible. So secular counseling has some strengths to it, but heart change is not going to happen apart from Christ.
Right.
So just more and more convicted of that. And then after I stepped away from counseling to focus on homeschooling, would get asked, well, would you be okay? Could we just meet, like one person, like, can we meet? So, okay, we can do that. And I used Philip's office, and then it just grew. I just would have more people say, would love so much if you could meet with me. And it got to the point where I just needed my own space. So my path to biblical counseling was very winding, not a direct out of high school, I'm going to pursue biblical counseling, you know.
So, Andy, you have a Master of Social Work from University of Tennessee. I assume there's some certifications that you have. That if you worked at the psychiatric hospital, there's some certifications that you have to go along with that. Is that correct?
That went with, yeah, for not licensing at the time, so, but like certified, yes, in social work. So,
How did you,
and
I'm sorry.
yeah, oh, go ahead.
I was only wanted to ask, how did you move from that into a biblical counseling model? Did you take additional classes? Did you read books? Did you have kind of
Yeah,
a counseling framework and you just needed to add the biblical perspective to it. Just tell us about
I
that.
think I think having that framework and then being in ministry for all these years, and I um, I love to read. I read passionately all the time, so I've just really immersed myself in that, and I'm currently completing a program through the National Christian Counselors
Okay.
Association. Um, so it's just a matter of combining all that I all that I know and all that I've experienced so far in ministry and then in my counseling experience.
Let me ask you if something comes to mind, and we didn't talk about this ahead of time, so it's okay if it doesn't. But there are lots of books being written now from a biblical counseling perspective. They're often easy to read and fairly easy to understand. So if you think about some particular subjects, are there books that you've read? Any books that you like on depression or anxiety or grief or
hmm
anger or suicide? Anything? Does anything come to mind on books by
You know,
subject?
Ed Welch has covered almost all of those
Hmm.
topics. I feel like he's my I would read him. I don't have to read the back of the book. I don't have to know anything about what the book is about. I'm going to read Ed Welch
Hmm.
because he's so very practical in his application.
Yeah.
And I appreciate him more than probably any other author that has influenced me.
Yeah. So, what's that been like trying to juggle your role in the church, your homeschooling three children who are in now into teenage years. I think I understood you say everything except math. That Philip's taking care of the math side,
Yes.
and you're also leading a kind of a growing ministry slash business that with biblical counseling. So how are you? How's the Lord helping you process all that? Keep your priorities in track. How are you doing there?
Yeah, you know how you learned, some of us learned earlier than others. I feel like it took a long time for me to learn that it was going to require me spending time every single day in the Word with the Lord in the morning,
Hmm.
in order to navigate all that is in front of me.
Hmm.
That it was never going to be something that I could. That was I will tell my kids all the time. You have to eat, you have to sleep, and you have to be in the Word.
Yeah.
Like those three things are non-negotiable for functioning well in your life.
Yeah.
You know, so as long as I keep that priority and I keep that time with the Lord, I feel like that is the key piece for me.
Yeah, well, super helpful and encouraging. So, Andy, this podcast or this conversation is called Leadership Lessons. Who is someone that's been kind of a role model for you in leadership? Maybe a woman in leadership. Certainly your husband. And what are some things you've learned about leadership from watching others or your own experiences?
Um, so my first, I think, example that I have is my dad, who was a counselor and a Bible teacher at the school that I attended. And what I learned from him, so many things, but as far as leadership, he genuinely and dearly and with his whole heart loved whoever was in front of him.
Well,
His students, his whoever he was counseling. He was in it in that moment, in his whole heart, he loved them. And he's in a nursing home now in Nashville, and he gets visits, probably 4 visits a week from a student that he taught. You know, I get messages all the time on Facebook, um, referencing him and asking about him, and that Christ-like leading with love, and that I think shaped me in so many ways.
so Andy, if you were to try to put into words what you witnessed your dad doing, in that's very clear in your mind that he loved whoever was in front of him. What did that look like exactly? Like, and how was that expressed?
It's one thing that I think Philip embodies too. That when someone is in front of Philip, or how with my dad, like you feel like you are all that is in their world in that moment. Like they are locked in, and you have their full attention in that moment. And you can tell like that their whole being, do you know what I'm saying, is
Hmm.
like engaged in the conversation. They genuinely fully care about you.
Well, what a model for you in the work that you're doing as in counseling to be able to give people that kind of attention. That means a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I've thought about that so many times that I'm not the most intelligent, the most gifted. What I bring is my heart.
Yeah.
Like I've learned that, and the Lord has gifted that ability to love the person in front of me.
You mentioned your dad as an example of leadership. Is there anyone else that you'd mention?
Yeah, so Philip is just Todd. I could have spent the whole time talking about my husband without any trouble. I'm so very crazy about him. He's just the most remarkable person. But watching him lead, he's this like calm, always calm. You
Mm-hmm.
can't ruffle Philip ever. But in leadership, he stays calm. He doesn't avoid confrontation, but he's calm.
Yeah.
And he just has a plan. Like, I didn't know when we came back to GVC that he had these long-term 5-year, 10-year, 15-year plans of where he wanted to take the church. And I can be more, this seems like a good idea. Let's do that, more fly by the seat of my
Right.
pants, which doesn't go over well with a congregation that's been there for 150 years,
Exactly right.
So watching, I think especially through the pandemic, seeing how he was able to lead so well, because at that point his congregation loved and trusted him, because of how he leads, how patiently he is to just sort of plot one step ahead and just knows where he's going to take the church, but isn't in a rush.
So, Andy, you're part of the Seeds of Grace ministry, women's ministry at Graefenburg. What is the Seeds of Grace ministry, and what's your part in that?
It is the just the women's ministry. When we came back here, the WMU is here, and it's amazing. I'm such a fan of the WMU.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have like a women's ministry program, so we launched that, I'd say about 11 years ago, shortly after we came. And there's a team of 11 women that are leading that, and we plan um, fellowships and retreats, and it's a lot of day to day meeting the needs in the congregation.
Yeah.
It goes back to I will not be able to even catch in a congregation of 300 if someone needs a meal, if
Mm-hmm.
someone's having a surgery. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So
I do.
we have a whole team, and then we plan meals and meet needs that we see from there.
So it sounds like they're involved in fellowship, encouragement, discipleship, as well as ministering and meeting practical needs. Do you all see folks connected to the church through this ministry? Do people come in and quickly get connected to the
Mm-hmm.
Seeds of Grace and find a
Yeah,
home?
they really do, and we have a Seeds of Grace Facebook page that it's one of those pages where you don't see unless you're a member of it. So and that's very helpful for connecting people when they come into the church.
Yeah.
Prayer requests and needs are, and it's funny. Philip will tell you, Seeds of Grace will know about something before the pastors.
Yeah, I'm sure
Because
that's true. And probably
something will
already
get
ministered to
posted.
it. They probably will report, hey, here's what's happened, but we've already taken care of it.
Yeah. So, or I'll do a little screenshot of a prayer request, and I'll be like, here's, so this person's not, I don't know if you know this.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
It has been just
How encouraging.
tremendous.
So, Andy, one last question. Young ministers' wives, folks who are just getting started, what one piece of advice would you give to a young minister's wife?
That is just not fair, Todd. One
Okay,
piece
two. You pick
of
the
it
number.
after almost 20 years.
You can give three.
I think, I don't think that it can be denied that the health of your marriage is going to directly affect the health of the church. I don't see how that couldn't be the case.
Yep.
How important it is that relationship be so strong, so close, that there's a lot of laughter there and real conversations at the end of every day. So that piece, and then going back to what I said earlier about, it's just important, I think, that pastor's wife, they do their own work. If there's stuff in their past, and if there's trauma, if there's childhood issues, that they address that with someone in an appropriate setting, so that they are more able to lead with authenticity,
Yeah.
and and communicate by their lives what they're trying to get across to their congregation.
And that's excellent advice for any person in ministry leadership. Take care of your marriage and work on yourself. Lead yourself
Yeah.
before you lead others. Thank you so much for your ministry, for your counseling work that you do, your engagement, involvement with Graefenburg. You and Philip, your marriage together, and your ministry of raising your children and serving in that congregation. We're grateful for you all, and thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Todd.
You're welcome.